started going into the museum. So 100 years ago, on April 20th, so Sunday, 100 years ago on Sunday, we had a quintessential event in America's history. It was the climax of months-long strike in the Colorado coalfield. Hey,
Come on in. There's some space right here. Come on in, Jean. There's some space.
You're fine.
No, I was just giving a quick introduction before we walk through the exhibit.
So, miners went on strike in 1913 because their working conditions were very unsafe and their salaries were very unfair. And so, to kind of give you a little context here, workers were not paid for the amount of work that they did. They were only paid for the amount of coal that they brought out of the mine. And so what that means, essentially, is that miners had to do a lot of work to, before they could even begin to extract the coal. Sometimes they would have to lay rail track down, or sometimes they would have to do what's called timbering. They would make a big wooden frame to be able to extract the coal. All of that work, they were not compensated for. They were only paid for the amount of coal that they brought out of the mine. And then when the mine operators weighed the coal, they cheated. They very much cheated. They had these people called check weighmen, and they were notorious for having, counting a ton of coal maybe as 2,400 pounds, 2,300 pounds. And so one of the things the miners wanted was the ability to pick the guy who weighed their coal. In terms of mine safety, it was nearly 4 times, Colorado had nearly 4 times the most dangerous coal mining place in the nation. There were so many coal mining deaths in the state of Colorado that, for example, in 1910, there were so many mine disasters that over 200 people died in the mines of southern Colorado in 1 year. And so these were the kinds of things that the miners went on strike for safety and getting paid for the actual work that they've done. Hey guys. And so when they went on strike in 1913, the company kicked them out of their company-owned homes, and they were forced to live in tents out on the plains of Colorado. Even when they went down there, the weather was bad. They endured a lot of bad weather. It's my family. They endured a lot of bad weather living in tents, but the weather wasn't the worst part of it. There was always violence in the tent colony. One of the most notorious examples of this was called the Death Special, and it was a car, like a regular car of the era, that they had taken to CF&I here in town, outfitted with steel plates. They also added a fog light and a machine gun, and they would take this Death Special car throughout the tent colonies, firing machine gun fire at the miners who were living in tents. And they weren't living in tents alone. They were living in tents with their children and their wives. And the tents were made out of canvas, which obviously is not a great barrier to machine gun fire. And so many of the people living in the tents would dig cellars under their tents as a place for safety. This is where they went when machine gun fire happened. This is where they went when the weather was bad. Sometimes they would store food under there. And they would also, this is where women gave birth, was in the tent cellars under tents. And so on April 20th, and you'll get more of the details when you go into the exhibit, but on April 20th, a fight breaks out. A gun battle breaks out, and there are many accounts of women and children running for safety. We've heard from a lot of descendants who've told us their family stories, where people may have been hiding in haystacks, running down the arroyo, running down the Apishapa River. There was a train that went through the tent colony that day that stopped, and many people jumped on the train for safety. And many families went into the tent cellars and hid as well. And so, very sadly, there were a number of people who were shot on that day in the battle, but most tragically, and the reason probably that we most remember Ludlow, is that there 11 children and 2 mothers died in the tent cellar where they were seeking safety. They, at the end of this gun battle, the National Guard lit the tents on fire in the tent colony. And the children and women who died under the tent cellar died from suffocation. And the details of what happened in that tent are pretty horrific. You know, there's accounts. There were 2 mothers who survived in the tent cellar, and their accounts of how they tried to climb out of the tent cellar, but their fingers were burned, and the children were falling back on the mothers, is really heart-wrenching. I think it's also heart-wrenching to realize that the tent cellar that everyone died in was the one in which they called the maternity chamber. It was a little larger than the other tent cellars, and this was the space where women would go to give birth when they lived in the tent colony. So the fact that this becomes, the maternity chamber becomes the death chamber, I think is a very profound piece to the story. On the children who endured the strike of 1913 and 1914. And you'll see as you go in there that over 9,000 children endured this strike in southern Colorado. This was not a small event. This impacted many, many families, and it impacted many children. And so we wanted to tell the story of the children's point of view. You know, a lot of people have told me that they think that it was smart to tell the children's point of view because they believe that by doing that, we avoided any political controversy in telling of the story. That by telling the children's point of view, we were telling the story of Ludlow in an apolitical way. And I very much disagree with that. When you consider that very, very rarely in U.S. history do we hear the perspective of the children of America's working poor, I think it's very profound and very political to be able to give the perspective of those children in America. And not only do we try to tell the story of America's working poor in America, but these were children who were living in a battlefield. They were literally living in a war zone, and we rarely hear a war story from a child's perspective. You know, we very often hear a perspective of soldiers. We rarely hear about the people that had no choice to be where they were. So we really wanted to give that perspective. I think it's also important to know that children were not just passive. They weren't just passive in all of this. They took an active role in the strike. There's a photo where you can see children marching in the streets of Trinidad with Mother Jones in protest of the way that people were being treated. People would not have been able to endure months of living in these tents had the daughters of miners not helped their mothers in the ways that they did. And so I think it's important to know that, you know, women and their daughters had a much harder role than probably anybody during the strike because they had to stretch food rations. You know, the union provided them with some money to buy food, but it was a whole lot less. They had to figure out how to feed a family on a whole lot less. There was extreme weather, tons of snow, it was very muddy. They had to work really hard to keep the tent colony, the tents in which they lived in, clean and healthy. And so I think in many ways I always want to point out that miners and their families could have never endured the months of living in a tent colony had it not been for the mothers and the daughters of the miners. And so that I hope gives
gives you a little perspective before we go into the exhibit. Are you all ready? Are there specific questions that folks have before we go in?
And I'm hoping that that you all can explore the exhibit in a self-guided way, but I will be available